Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, deathslice, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today we go global because I want to do, what will probably be a somewhat lengthy video about Christian Zionism. And this is a topic I've wanted to do for quite a few years now, and I've had notes all together. And a very complicated topic with a lot of details. So I'm just going to do kind of a big overview. So this is mostly for people who really don't know that there is such a thing as Christian Zionism. And what a long history it has. That's one of the most important things. But it's a strange thing. I've always been perplexed by the existence of such a large scale of Christian Zionism because there's some ideas that are at odds with each other. So let's get to the basic premise of Christian Zionism is that the belief among Christians that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land and the establishment of Israel in 1948 is in accordance with biblical prophecy. And the term use began in the mid-20th century, superseding Christian restorationism and dispensationalism. But it's a prerequisite to the second coming, and when that happens, all the Jews will become Christians. And of course, that's at the heart of what I have at issue with Christian Zionism, is because this belief amongst Christians that somehow the second coming will happen and all the Jews will convert to Christianity. And this is completely at odds, of course, with the Jewish version of things, where all the Christians will come to the Middle East and will all become Jews. So anyway, there's a big problem there, and I think the Christian confidence that somehow they're going to convert all these Jews. Well, I guess the second coming could be pretty inspiring. Maybe that would be enough to make them convert. But anyway, the Christian advocacy of the restoration of the Jews goes back to Protestant Reformation, and the ideas were brought to America by the Puritans. So the very kernels of Christian Zionism have been in the United States since the very beginning, and it showed up early in 1818. President John Adams supported a Jewish homeland and talked about it. Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, was a supporter of a Jewish homeland. And in 1844, George Bush, I'm sure some distant relation, was a professor of Hebrew at New York University. He published a pro-Israel book, so it's an idea that goes back a long way and has its beginnings all the way at the roots of the birth of the United States. So anyway, then we get to skip ahead a little bit, because the fomentation of Christian Zionism, as we know about, really became gather steam and become a force to be reckoned with by the 1880s. And of course, that has a lot to do with immigration as well, but it also has to do with consolidation of these ideas by radical Jewish thinkers and the Zionist movement. And a lot of the timing coincides with a lot of things that were happening in Europe at the same time. So by the 1880s, we had a lot of Zionist organizations appear in the United States, and by 1898, the first annual conference of American Zionists happened. By 1910, there was 20,000 Zionists in the U.S., and they were already influencing Congress by influencing lawyers, professors, and businessmen. So that's an interesting point right there, going all the way back to 1910. Even a very small group of Zionists in the U.S. relative to the population was already able to influence Congress and already operating using methods that are continue to be used to this day, using lawyers and businessmen and operating on American college campuses. And then in 1912, very prominently, Louis Brandeis, prominent lawyer and a friend of Woodrow Wilson, was a very pro-Zionist, and by 1914, Louis Brandeis actually became head of world Zionism and appointed to the Supreme Court by President Wilson. So interesting point there, that we have a member of the Supreme Court who was head of world Zionism in 1914. And also interesting that that all coincides with, of course, the creation of the Federal Reserve and the instigation of the income tax in 1913. And then the Zionists getting us into World War I, and that's an oft-discussed stories where we'll have to look elsewhere to get most of the details, but basic gist is there was a point where it seemed like Germany was willing to call the war a stalemate and offer a peace plan. And apparently the Zionists told President Wilson that he should get into the war, and he promised the Europeans that they would get Wilson and the United States into the war, and this supposedly they did, because the United States did enter the war, but supposedly with a lot of pressure from Zionists at that time. But like I say, that's too deep a subject to get into just in this video right now, but well worth looking into. And so early on, with the Zionists and Jewish settlers moving to the Middle East through the 1920s and 1940s, there was a lot of violence increasing as colonization increased. One has to remember at that point, Palestine in the 1800s was 80% Muslim, 15% Christian, and a mere 5% Jewish, all living together successfully for quite some thousands of years, contrary to the common narrative out there. And all these people lived in peace in that region, throughout the whole region, not just in Palestine. Although, of course, one can historically point it to different examples of otherwise. But anyway, so let's remember that. And so as colonization, these settlers increased through the 20s and 40s. Of course, the violence increased, and front groups in the U.S. funneled money and arms to the Jewish terrorist groups, and they were known as Jewish terrorist groups globally. And even Albert Einstein, the leading Jewish intellectuals, considered a lot of tactics used very familiar, and described them as Nazi-ish tactics. And so anyway, but we had a lot of Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists in the United States funneling money and arms through that whole period of the 20s and 30s and 40s. And these Zionist groups still continue to target congressmen, clergy, editors, professors, businessmen, labor leaders, and veterans. So then by the time we get to 1940, and remember this is only 8 years before Israel is declared a state, the American Zionist Emergency Council was created. And by 1943, they already had a $500,000 budget. The year before, there was a group called the United Jewish Appeal, 1939. By 1941, they had $14 million in budget. In 1948, it's mere 7 years later, by the time the Jewish state was created, they had $150 million. So there's a lot of money involved in this Christian Zionism and these groups. So part of it, of course, will be motivated by the fact that they can make a lot of money being involved in supporting Zionists, but also, like I say, this religious affinity for some reason. And that's in spite of the fact that by the 1940s, there was a Zionist plot to bomb the U.S. with a plane for not allowing more Jewish immigration. And the pilot was even hired and exposed, and oddly enough has a connection, being a friend of Richard Nixon. So another topic worth a whole nother video about the Zionist plot in the 40s for the Zionists to bomb the U.S. with a plane for not allowing Jewish immigration. But by the 40s, there was 400 local committees, 76 state and regional branches that funded books and articles, academic studies, millions of pamphlets, petitions and letter writing campaigns, and targeting colleges. So a very concerted effort. Once again, a lot of the same methods that are continued to be used today to take this very small message in a way, because the percentage of Jews in this country today even is a mere 3%, and for the kind of influence they have, particularly on our foreign policy, and how many Zionists and pro-Israel people we have in our government, some more overt than others, but all things certainly to be considered, that we need to consider. And like I say, this history of Christian Zionism in the United States goes back a long ways, and I skipped over a part about in the 1890s and 1891, because two important points. One is the fact that Blackstone lobbied President Benjamin Harrison for a Jewish state, and the petition included prominent government figures, including Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. And I wanted to bring up that point because it's important to remember that early on you had the Jewish banking community in the United States, and all the biggest banks supporting the pro-Zionist movement, and they continue to do so today. So something to bear in mind. This is not a new development. And then we look at modern Christian Zionism, and that's where I really have a problem, of course, because we have churches being used for not only for propaganda, but for warmongering and fear-mongering and racism. And we have and of course they get a tax break, but the incendiary language and the blind support of Zionism and Israeli policies, in spite of all the things that go on in Israel and their occupation and their occupation of Gaza. But anyway, but there's a lot of resistance criticism of Zionism in the U.S. And we know that, and that's duly noted as well, although it's easy to bring up all these empty charges of anti-Semitism when anyone is critical of the policies of Israel. And it really doesn't, I've been over this argument a million times. It really has nothing to do with being anti-Semitic. It has to do with government policies and neo-colonialism and apartheid and racism and war. And so anyway, we do have Christian leaders who are critical of Zionism and Israeli policies, as well as people in the Pentagon and the State Department, intelligence agencies, and Jewish anti-Zionists and Christians who advocate for Arabs. But of course, that's a lot smaller voices than we have in the pro-Israel camp. But we have to remember that there's a lot of criticism out there. It's just a real touchy subject. And then, in 2006, we had the creation of the Jerusalem Declaration on Christian Zionism. And it substitutes a political military program for the teachings of Jesus and creates an obstacle to peace. And that's what a lot of these Christian Zionist groups, particularly ones that have operations going on in Israel and the United States, it's all about a political agenda and really has nothing to do with any religious values. 2007, we had the National Council of Churches that was critical of Christian Zionism, and so there are Christians in the United States that are not quite so pro-Zionist, including United Church of Christ, Presbyterian Church, United Methodist Church, but nonetheless we have some very notable high-profile pro-Israel, pro-Zionist people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, John Hagee, Mike Huckabee, Alan Keyes, Glenn Beck, Jeff Cotton, John Cotton. So we have a lot of government people, congressmen, media people that are all very outspoken in their support of Israel, and some more than others. John Hagee is one of the worst, and he really should be cut off from any government tax breaks for the kind of incendiary propaganda he spreads. And I remember when everyone was concerned about Reverend Wright and his racism and his fear-mongering and his incendiary speeches, and I think people need to take a good look at John Hagee as well. And so then, we have, like I say, all this cross-collaboration between all the Christian pro-Zionist groups and all the Israeli propaganda groups in Israel itself too. And then on top of this, as you're getting a picture of, there's just so many groups. You'd think that with the Jewish representation, 3% in the United States, there wouldn't be quite so many groups, and it wouldn't involve that much money. But it's very disproportionate. The International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which is a charity that has $100 million a year, the Center for Jewish Christian Understanding in Israel, and their millions of dollars they get to use every year. And then the Christians United for Israel, that's the largest group, and that's the one that's fronted by John Hagee, that operates on 225 college campuses across the country. And also I wanted to mention that International Fellowship of Christians and Jews is also the ones where they run the infomercials, getting charity money from people in the United States to send to all the poor Israelis. And like I brought up in other videos, it's kind of a scam in a way, because Israel is a very rich country, and they have a welfare state, a social welfare state, and the fact that we have charities operating in the United States to send money to help the poor in Israel, it's kind of disconcerting. But Christian Zionists are notable, and I'm going to use a list that's in one of the articles that I'll attach below, but things that we should be concerned about as far as Christian Zionists, and I better take a a good drink before I go over this list. But Christian Zionists are notable that killing of Muslim civilians is acceptable, even though killing of civilians, whether if they're Jews or Christians, is not acceptable. And Christian Zionists like to have the Israeli flag right next to the U.S. flag, right in the churches. And Christian Zionists like to send the military, not missionaries anymore. And Christian Zionists think of Iran as an existential threat, even though it's never even remotely been proven. Christian Zionists support torture and Guantanamo. Christian Zionists hate that Obama promoted Ramadan, but was okay with George Bush doing it. Christian Zionists think Muslims hate us for our freedoms, when mostly we know it's political and it's blowback, and that's been established by numerous studies, even within the government and intelligence communities, that it's almost all politically driven from foreign occupation. Christian Zionists like to never mention Israel's nukes, even though they want to discuss all nukes in the Arab world. Christian Zionists never criticize Saudi Arabia, and Christian Zionists think that everyone in the Middle East, except for the Jews, are terrorists. And Christian Zionists love the Israeli Defense Forces. And last but not least, one of my favorites, Christian Zionists fear that Sharia law is coming to the United States. So we have a population of Muslims in the United States that's less than 1%, is theoretically going to be 2% in the next 20 years. And yet somehow that small portion is going to spread Sharia law all over the United States. But that's a good example, and I'll finish with that. Just that whole idea that Christian Zionists have, that somehow the United States is going to be overrun by Muslims, and then they fear a handful of people who have Muslim connections of any sort being in the government, and yet our government is disproportionately stocked with Christian Zionists and Jewish and dual citizenship people. So they're already there. And let's remember how Christian Zionism manifests sometimes, when we have Donald Rumsfeld working with the military to put Christian inscriptions on bombs that are going over the Middle East, and Bush talking about his holy war and crusade and his mission from God. So those are the dangers of Christian Zionism that we see in our own time. But like I say, it's fascinating to see what a long and illustrious history the Christian Zionists have in the United States, and for a lot of reasons I find it inexplicable to this day. I'm a useful idiot, don't you be one too.